What's going on, YouTube? We're back at it for another video, and today we've got that huge new patch inside of Helldivers 2, one that has basically been a step in the right direction. More than a few quality changes to some of these stratagems and quality of life changes for some of them as well. It may not be perfect, there's definitely some things that I would say still need to be worked on, and more than likely some of them that kind of need to be a little bit reworked with certain changes that they've made, but overall this patch has been quite a good one, and it has pushed things in a better direction, as well as giving us a bit more build diversity when it comes to the options of stratagems we have available to use between each one of the dives that we take. And we're going to go through and key highlight some of the best changes within this patch and some information that I'd probably just want to get out there, since the devs do seem to be listening, as there are more than a few changes that are things that I've either asked about and I've seen other people ask to have these changes implemented as well. So they're definitely listening, and they're going in a better direction than they have been with these previous patches, so this is good news, and hopefully we can continue to keep this trend going within the patches in the coming future. But that being said, we've got more than a few things to cover, so let's get straight into it. Now, coming up first, we've got the Rocket Sentry. This was a bit of a buff to this one. It's still not exactly the greatest stratagem out there, or exactly the greatest sentry out there, as it is a little bit confusing with some of the changes that they made to it, but it definitely did get a buff to it. Previously, as you'll probably see inside of the preview video, this would fire 2 rockets and then pause, and one of the changes that they made with this one was the fact that it now just shoots 1 rocket at a time. Now, when I first read this, I thought this might actually be a problem and that it would end up being very slow at firing these rockets, but thankfully, after using it, it is definitely much better off at shooting 1 rocket at a time, as it's basically just sending them off one after the next and really being more effective and more consistent with dealing that damage across the board. Now, beyond that, they did increase the distance at which it is going to acquire these targets up to 100 meters, which is quite nice, especially if you're able to throw this off at a good position on a bit of high ground. This will be able to just volley those rockets down and be able to just eliminate those threats before it gets eliminated by those enemies that it may be firing at. Now, it still does prioritize larger targets, which is a little bit of a problem considering they did decrease the explosion armor penetration. The explosion is no longer damaging heavily armored enemies, and what I think that means is that the explosive damage is not penetrating through that heavy armor anymore. Right now, what is happening is the direct impact is going to deal damage, but it is going to be diminished damage against the armored target that it's hitting. But if you do blow off the armor, that's when you'll get that explosive increase of damage. But it did get a buff to its overall damage output, so now it is dealing a bit more damage than it was before, and at that same point, it does feel as though it is more geared towards taking on a little bit of crowd control when it comes to medium enemies than actually being something that would take down heavily armored targets. But I will say it is fantastic at taking down factory striders or anything that has the capability of having its armor blown off. Sadly enough, when it comes to heavily armored tanks or cannon turrets or possibly even hulks, these targets aren't exactly going to be the best for the Rocket Sentry, but chargers, bile titans, and factory striders, the ones that you can actually blow the armor off of, these are going to end up being a little bit easier to take down with the Rocket Sentry, considering after a few rockets it will be able to blow off the armor and then get that maximum damage towards the weak spot that may be available to it. Now, Bile Titan might be a little bit more finicky when it comes to being able to blow off that armor, but if it can get it done, it will be something that can take them down by itself as well. Just not very quickly, but it will deal with chargers and factory striders quite well. And overall, beyond that, it will be dealing with the medium type enemies such as Devastators or groups of Terminid a little bit more efficient, especially considering its explosive radius was increased from 1 meter to 4 meters, so if you have some of those tightly grouped up patrols or just enemies in general, it will be able to have an explosive radius dealing damage to everybody within the area of the target that's been hit, which can be quite useful when facing off with a Terminid or a group of Devastators, as it will have the stagger power along with that. Overall, it's not perfect, but the Rocket Sentry is definitely better off with these changes, and I'd like to see it have a little bit more single target damage than it does right now. But at an endpoint, it may end up becoming something quite useful for some type of sentry build in the future, as sentries did get an increase to their overall durability, so they are a bit stronger when it comes to laser fire as well as melee damage from the Terminid. So here in the coming up future, definitely going to be rolling out with some of those loadouts for sentries. That should be quite fun. So do hit that subscribe button. We've got some of the best coming out. Just after that, we've got the HMG emplacement, which this did have an increase to its quality of life with the increase to its rotation speed by 100%. This feels so much better. I had been using this with a sentry build that I was playing around with just before this patch, just to kind of have some fun. And it was extremely powerful then, and it is even more powerful now. It is going to be much more useful to you as well at holding down certain positions and just being able to whip around without feeling like immediately one target just behind you is going to end up killing you before you can even turn around to land some shots on it. It may not be the fastest when it comes to turning outside of its 90-degree radius once it starts to get a little bit slower, but it is 10 times faster than what it was before, and it is much more viable. I would highly suggest giving this a try, as it can take down hulks. It will take down medium-type enemies very easily, and it is very effective at taking out more than a few structures out there, including the shrieker nests, the spore trees, and just large groups of enemies in general. Coming up right after that, we have the anti-personnel minefield and the incendiary mines. We're just going to talk about both of these in general, considering they both got an increase to their overall explosive damage. Now, for me personally, this hasn't been much of a huge change to it. The anti-personnel mines are going to do a little bit better than the incendiary mines, as far as I can tell when it came to facing off with the Terminate, especially if you're going to try one of these just to, basically use something to have a fresh stratagem to play around with. The anti-personnel minefield would be the one that I would say is going to be the more ideal option, but in general, I wouldn't say these are still at a viable point of being a better stratagem to come in with than a lot of the other stratagems you have available to you. It could be a little bit of fun at times, but probably one of the worst aspects to the anti-personnel minefield, or the mines in general, is that it feels like one target can come in, basically land on one, and then end up having its body fly over to multiple, and ends up causing a chain reaction that ends up blowing up so many of them that it almost feels as though just one enemy can end up basically destroying half of your total DPS output from one of these stratagems, which can be just a huge waste and not feel like you're actually getting the most out of stopping certain key locations with these minefields. Coming up right after that, we've got the Orbital Gatling Barrage, which is absolutely now one of those S-tier stratagems. I was using this one before, but it really wasn't that effective. A lot of times I would just throw it into an Eradicate mission just to have something for a little bit of explosive damage when it came to just locking down some type of bug breach. It would kill a few things here and there, but mostly a lot of times it would really just soften things up. But now they've reduced its cooldown down to 70 seconds, and if you further have the ship module to further decrease the orbitals, this is going to come down to basically 63 seconds. It is going to be very quick uptime. You're going to be using this quite often. But on that same note, they've increased the fire rate by 25%. They've doubled the total rounds that'll be landing on the ground, and they've made it to where this now can penetrate medium armor and heavily armored targets. So not only are you having something that has crowd control capabilities, but it will also be destroying a lot of those medium type enemies and softening up some of those heavily armored targets, such as the Hulk, which with Chargers, Bile Titans, and Hulks, they will get staggered by this, so sometimes they can get stuck in the middle of that barrage, but other times they will be able to walk out of that. A lot of times I would say your best bet is always going to throw one of those stun grenades in to get the most damage output from it, but at that same point, it may not be the best stratagem to take down heavily armored targets, but the capability of being able to having a little bit of damage on them as well is going to be beneficial to just taking them out as quickly as possible. And on top of that, if you throw this in the middle of a Shrieker nest, it can end up destroying the entire Shrieker nest as long as those rounds do end up starting to hit that. It makes it a lot easier and a little bit more versatile, as well as being able to take out the spore trees. Coming up right after that, we've got Orbital Precision Strike, which is one of those stratagems that I'd been using more recently, as it was one of those 1-2 punch combos with the Eagle Airstrike to take down Factory Striders. Anytime that I'd seen a Factory Strider, I'd just come in with an Orbital Precision, land that underneath that Factory Strider, and then just have one Eagle Airstrike come in and just blow it up. And the only thing that I had a problem with this actual stratagem was the call-in time, considering it was 5 seconds just about every time. And if you had that 50% increase to the call-in time, it just made it even worse. But they've improved it in a very big way, to the point where now it is a call-in time of 2 seconds, and they've further reduced the cooldown time to 90 seconds, so you'll have this one up quite often. Not only is it going to be good at taking down bigger targets such as a Bile Titan, one-shotting Hulks, or possibly even heavily armored tanks. I mean, it's probably one of the most versatile options you can use right now, especially considering now you have the availability to call this in a lot more quickly and be a little bit more precise with it, rather than trying to work through the algorithm as to whether or not you could actually get the trajectory on this with the timing and actually line it up with that moving target coming towards you. Couldn't tell you how many times it got so frustrating to try and hit a Bile Titan with this, especially if I had an 8-second call-in time for it. But thankfully now the maximum we'll get is about 4 seconds for the call-in time with this. But now with a 2-second call-in time, if you don't have that modifier further increasing it, it is going to be extremely easy. And on top of that, it's closing up bug holes. It can close up multiple of them. It does have a little bit of a blast radius similar to the 500 kg, so outside radius is going to have some damage dealt, and this can be beneficial when it comes to taking on groups of devastators or groups of medium enemies on the Terminid side, as if you're able to throw in a stun grenade, toss in that orbital precision strike, you might be able to take out a good group of them. I've had as many as 7 devastators and 1 strike from this. It is quite powerful. So if you can use the combination of something like the stun grenade along with this in order to hold those targets in position and then allow that orbital precision strike to land on them, you could take out groups with this. It is going to be quite the versatile option when it comes to the stratagem. I would highly suggest giving this one a try, as you will be able to destroy just about everything, including research bases. Effectively, look at this as a 500 kg that has a 90-second cooldown. At this point, I may as well just replace the 500 kg with this and then just be using some other type of Eagle stratagem, which just makes me have a good bit more of a versatile option when it comes to the loadouts I have coming in the future. I really enjoy the fact that they've tried to make some of these orbitals in line with the effectiveness of the Eagles, and this is working out perfectly and giving a whole lot more build diversity. Coming up right after that, we'll make a quick note about the orbital airburst strike. This did get a cooldown reduction by 20 seconds down to 100 seconds. This one's not bad. It can deal substantial damage towards devastators or any type of medium type enemy, can even lock down some of those bug breaches. The dangerous part about it is the simple fact that it does have a good bit of RNG as to where that shrapnel lands around the marker in front of you. Sometimes it feels like it just veers off to the right, left, or anywhere around that marker and can be very deadly towards teammates or even to yourself if you're somewhere within almost a 20 to 40 meter radius in the circular radius of that marker. So do be careful with this one. I would really like to see this get a little bit better grouping in the future, or a bit more consistent with where it strikes, because even without the orbital scatter stratagem modifier, this ends up feeling like it almost always has that modifier attached to it. So that's something that I'd like to see kind of worked around with this in the future, but overall this is something that could be quite beneficial to utilizing for crowd control, especially with this patch, considering we'll get to it a little bit later, but there's a lot more hordes of enemies than there are heavily armored targets when it comes to this patch in general. Coming up right after that, we've got the Eagle 110mm rocket pods. Now, if you've been watching my channel for quite a while, I've pretty much talked about the rocket pods quite often. They were one of my better options when it came to dealing with Bile Titans. They were a bit more consistent when it came to hitting the target than the 500 kg at times. It was always one of those toss-up moments, and 90% of the time I'd end up having the rocket pods do a better job at being able to take out the Bile Titans than the 500 kg at certain times, considering it will be one of those stratagems that you can throw near the target and then it will lock onto that target and hit them. But the biggest issue was that it had inconsistency when it came to actually hitting the target. It was not something that would hit 90% of the time. A lot of times it would feel like 70% of the time, especially against the Bile Titan, but anything else that was moving, like a Charger, a Hulk, it generally would a lot of times just land behind it or even just hit one rocket into it and just feel like a complete misfire. Just about every time, which was really frustrating. But now they've improved the targeting on this one, and I will say without a doubt this is pretty much 90% of the time hitting the target. It is very rare that this does not hit the target, and the only time that it doesn't is if it's walking outside of the radius near the marker that you've actually thrown it. A lot of times it may be user error that ends up causing this thing not to land on the target you want it to, or at least that's how it's working now. Now, they did increase the armor penetration value up to 100% damage to heavily armored enemies, but they have in total decreased the actual damage from the projectile from 600 down to 250, which is something I'm not too happy about, but after using it, it is definitely still hitting just about the same when it comes to dealing with something like a heavily armored tank or even dealing with Bile Titans and Chargers. And the maximum amount of damage you're going to get out of this is when you've broken the armor and it's hitting an exposed weak spot, which is why it still has the capability of one-shotting a heavily armored tank, because it can hit that exposed weak spot on the back end of it. So it will get its maximum amount of damage in that moment, enough to actually destroy that heavily armored tank. But I'd say one of the best uses for the Eagle 110 rocket pods right now is being able to blow off the armor on the backside of a Bile Titan. This is exactly basically what I used it for a lot of times in the past, was just throwing 2 of these down and being able to take down a Bile Titan, and it's still going to be that consistent at this point. But now that it has more armor penetrating capabilities, a lot of times you'll find that just one rocket pod has the capability of blowing off the armor on the backside of a Bile Titan, which is going to be a huge benefit to you, especially if you're using something like a flamethrower or a grenade launcher, or even the primary weapons such as the Scorcher, the Punisher Plasma, or the Purifier. Each one of those, if you're able to expose that back weak spot on the Bile Titan itself, you can land shots with any one of those weapons over the shoulder of wherever that exposed weak spot is, and you'll be able to take down that Bile Titan extremely quickly, even with the flamethrower, which is going to be something that can melt it quite quickly. And before, I was using the rail cannon strike to get this done, but now since we've got the rocket pods capable of doing this in one strike, effectively you're looking at the capability of being able to take down 3 Bile Titans with one use of your Eagle Stratagems, if you have the combination of something like the Scorcher, the grenade launcher, or any type of explosive weapon, or any support weapon in general that has the capability of dealing substantial damage towards that exposed weak spot on that Bile Titan. Coming up right after that, we've got the Eagle Strafing run, which this one I'm going to be short and sweet with it. It's interesting. It now has the capability of dealing damage towards heavily armored targets. It's not that much damage. I have had moments where I was able to finish off a Hulk with it, but it was already damaged from something like the Gatling Barrage. I used it in combination with the Gatling Barrage as one of those methods where you can throw the Gatling Barrage to kind of stun lock a certain group of enemies, or a bot drop, a bug breach, and then kind of go in a circular radius, throwing down the strafing runs to kind of clean up the enemies in the middle, kind of combining the damages to have a little bit more of that crowd control effect and really cleaning it up and just locking it down in general. It's an interesting playstyle. It's still a little bit weird to use this. I wouldn't say this one's the greatest one. You know, play around with it. We do have 5 uses of it now, but in general, it is much better now. It will chew through Devastators anytime that you're able to hit them, as well as any medium type enemies. And it's almost like an instant call in. As soon as you drop this down in front of you, it's basically going to go right after and just line up with that machine gun fire. One thing that is a little bit irritating for me is that it does feel very linear. It's a very thin line going forward in front of you, and sometimes it can feel as though it's a little bit off from the marker in front of you. It can feel like it's off to the right or off to the left, and you're not exactly getting a very precise aim going forward in front of you. So in times like that, it can be a little bit hit or miss. I don't really mind that, but I wouldn't mind in the future possibly having some type of upgrade that doubled up the guns on the front of this to give it a little bit of a wider area of effect when it came to the strafing run, and I think that would make this much more viable for me, especially with the damage output that it has right now. I just want it to be more of that crowd control, and since it's not completely eliminating any one of those heavily armored targets and just kind of softening them up a bit and giving a little bit of stagger on them, I think it would be something that would benefit this stratagem quite well. But that's something I just like to see as a quality of life change in the coming future. For right now, it's something I can play around with. It's not bad at crowd control. It's definitely better than it was before, but I wouldn't say it's one of those top tier stratagems. But let me know how you feel down in the comments below. Coming up right after that, we've got the grenade launcher, which this one just got a little bit of a buff. It got 50 more damage added to it, and it is very noticeable. This thing is 2-shotting brood commanders. It's 1-shotting hive guards if you're shooting at their weak point and not directly at their medium armor, but in certain instances you may even be able to 1-shot them if you land that shot directly in the face. Not always is that going to be the case, but in general, if you're hitting the weak spot on the back of them or the exposed fleshy bits, you'll be able to take them out in no time. And this thing is just cleaning up so much faster. It feels so much better, and it has truly made the grenade launcher shine a bit more when it comes to facing off with the Terminid. And it's taken down those behemoth chargers much more effectively than it was before. And if you give it a try, shooting underneath that, trying to bounce it towards that weak spot, you will notice the difference quite quickly. I've had consistent moments where I am constantly being able to just get them down in half of a magazine from one of these, and I'll be updating my best Terminid loadout with the grenade launcher and some of these new stratagems, as there is a better combination of a loadout for the Terminid now that feels way stronger, and the grenade launcher is at the tip of the spear for it, and it is feeling so much better, and I love it. Coming up right after that, we've got the heavy machine gun. Now this one was one that when I read the patch notes, I thought this might be a little bit weaker, but it is basically tenfold better than what it was before. This thing is much better at taking out the automatons than it was previously. They reduced the overall rate of fire on this one, which I thought was going to hurt it, but it's actually made it much more manageable and much easier to to start landing some of those shots on those targets. As well as the reticle feeling a little bit more centered. It still does kind of just bounce up a little bit and make it a little bit finicky, but if you can aim just directly below that red dot as soon as you start firing, because it just kicks up, so it kicks that red dot up and it makes it feel as though it's off center, even though it's more of like a visual bug almost. But beyond that point, they've increased the damage, they've reduced the overall reload time, and they've increased its damage towards durable body parts, as well as given it a little bit of stagger strength, which I'll be honest, it's not very noticeable with the stagger. It's not really like stun locking Devastators, but from a distance, you're taking out Devastators really quickly. It's much easier to land those shots, and it is chewing through them with that increase of the overall damage. And when it comes down to taking down Hulks, it is so much easier. As long as you're crouching and sitting still, you'll more than likely be able to just tap fire into some of the faces of those Hulks from a little bit of a distance and be melting them in 1/4 of your entire magazine. So more than likely in one magazine, you could be taking down 2 Hulks and then being able to clean up more than a few of those Devastators right after that. I'm going to be making a loadout for this one because I had quite a bit of fun while playing around with this, and it's definitely something that's kind of given me a little bit of fresh air when it comes to facing off with the automatons. I don't necessarily think I'm going to be able to make the Rambo loadout, as we'll be talking about the crossbow a little bit later, but I may do it just for the meme, considering the heavy machine gun is feeling so much better now. And since we have that combat knife, which we'll talk about that later in a different video. But at the same time, with its durable damage towards those body parts being increased as well, taking out the legs of Hulks is much easier at the same point, so don't be afraid to just start cutting loose on one of those legs, slowing them down, and then emptying some of those rounds into its face and making it a much easier target for you. Can make for a pretty interesting and fun cinematic moment for yourself. But let me know down in the comments below how you're feeling about the heavy machine gun. Coming up right after that, we've got the new best assault rifle inside of the game, which is going to be the Tenderizer, the one weapon that came in with the polar opposites war bond that ended up basically coming in obsolete. Apparently it just did not come in with the proper stats, and now it has 95 damage. It's very accurate. A lot of people are more than likely going to truly enjoy this one. It may not have the medium armor penetration, but it does have the capability of dealing quite substantial damage. When facing off with a Terminid, it's not too bad. Probably the only thing that irritates me is the fact that it's only got 30 rounds in the magazine. You can be clearing through those magazines fairly quickly and find yourself on constant reload, which can be irritating. It's one of the reasons that I hate the Punisher Plasma. But in general, this is probably going to be a lot of people's favorite type of assault rifle. They're going to enjoy it. I'm right there with you. It's not too bad. And when it comes down to facing off with the automatons, it is very clear that the development team is looking at making the assault rifle something that's more geared towards taking off the limbs or dealing damage towards the limbs, as we're focusing more on durable damage. So I'd say if you're using the Tenderizer when facing off with the automatons, as I tried it, it is very accurate, so it is quite easy to knock off the Gatling Sentry arm of a heavy Devastator, or just focus fire on the rockets on the back of Devastators in order to blow those off. And in general, it does seem as though you will be able to basically cut their life in half and basically make them not as deadly as they were before, so that may be your role as an assault rifle type of person. At times, I feel the Adjudicator is one that would be better suited for this, but considering the Adjudicator does not have the same level of accuracy as the Tenderizer, and it has less damage than the Tenderizer, you may be better off just using the Tenderizer as that assault rifle to kind of help tear down and rip apart those Devastators effectively. That seems to be the goal that they've had in mind, and I wish they would kind of stated this a little bit earlier on, as even with this patch, it's written in the details, but it's not exactly something at the forefront that they're saying, we want assault rifles to basically be tearing at the limbs rather than dealing damage to the mass of the body. Coming up right after that, we've got the explosive crossbow. I'm going to make this very short and sweet. It's not very good against the Terminid. I wish they would bring back the explosive radius to this. Apparently this one now says that it's medium armor penetrating, and that it does have a increased demolition strength, so it can destroy bug holes and bot fabricators. So that's a bit of a quality of life improvement to this. Kind of wish it had that from the beginning, but I think that's just something to compensate for the fact that it doesn't feel as though they're going to give us the same explosive radius back that we had originally, which made this weapon so much greater. If they just added that back in, the exploding crossbow would be something I would highly consider to be viable, especially against the Terminid. At this point, it's basically focused on single target damage towards medium type enemies, and it doesn't do very well against that. A lot of times, especially if you're going against the automatons, which it's better suited for right now, it's still going to take 4 shots directly to the body of any one of those devastators unless you're able to hit that headshot, and that's not always going to be that easy. So in general, it feels as though I'm getting 1 Devastator per magazine, and with how slow this fires, it can feel a bit clunky, slow, and just irritating in general. Coming up right after that, everybody's personal favorite from back in the day, the Eruptor, is something that does need to get the shrapnel back. I just need to state that up front. I really wish that they would rework the system to just bring back the shrapnel, or at least in the background just be working on this, because at some point this it just deserves to have the shrapnel back. It has to be said. It's something that even with this further increase to its total damage, this buff didn't really bring it back up to the same prime that it was before. It still has the capability of destroying bug holes and fabricators. It's 2-shotting devastators, but when it comes to facing off with the Terminid, it is not something I would highly suggest choosing, and even against the automatons with the capability of 1-shotting Striders now and 2-shotting devastators, and I will say quality of life change to the scope. They have changed the scope on it. It is much more clear. It's much better looking. I have a much better time using it, but in general, it's something that feels a little bit more niche, and it's just not as effective as it once was. It's not bad, the buff does help it a bit, and if you're somebody that enjoys sniping but doesn't want to use the anti-material rifle and you want something that's like an explosive that has a little bit of that versatility with the capability of destroying fabricators, this is an option for you, and more than likely you can have a little bit of fun with it. But overall, I'm still team get that shrapnel back. But let me know how you feel down in the comments below. Now, one thing to note is the fact that they have taken away the anti-aircraft defenses modifier when it comes to facing off with the automatons, which is good and bad. The reason it's good is because now no longer we have -1 stratagem, which was basically every other mission objective on any of the missions that wasn't a defending planet, and it was very irritating to constantly be stuck with just 3 stratagems. But now that they've taken it away, every single mission that we go into is going to be 50% call-in time and 25% cooldown increase if you're playing at level 9 difficulty, which is pretty frustrating. It makes it almost just as stale, and it's always something that I'll basically have to work around. I don't really mind it. I'll get it done, but what is very confusing to me is why they haven't made some type of like radar jammers similar to what they have with the Terminid, which is going to block all visibility of the actual map. I'm surprised they didn't add this in as a modifier. I think it would be very strong, and it would actually increase the challenge against the automatons not to be able to see where their bases are or where their patrols are coming from. Instead, having to utilize my sight and sound in order to kind of work around the map, and it could make things a bit more challenging. I would like to see that in the coming future. That would be something that would basically benefit the overall gameplay and add challenge without it feeling very stale and very irritating. As right now, just having the 50% call-in time and the 25% cooldown constantly is going to be just as irritating as the -1 stratagem, in my personal opinion. But let me know how you feel down in the comments below. The next change after that is going to be the armored enemy balance. Effectively, what they've done is, yet again, they've reduced the total number of heavily armored units that we'll be facing off with and further increased the medium to smaller enemies. You may have noticed it in tenfold when it comes to facing off with the automatons, and even more so when it comes to the amount of hunters that you'll be dealing with against the Terminid right now. It looks like an absolute sea of them sometimes, and it is quite crazy. Crowd control is going to be at the forefront right now, and thankfully some of these stratagems, especially the orbital Gatling barrage, are going to help alleviate these moments, and thankfully the pyro build is absolutely dominating. Fire is going to be one of your best friends. Napalm is going to be burning those Terminid into the moonlight. We're going to have to be putting out some of these loadouts for crowd control because it is definitely going to be necessary. It's a bit frustrating at times, but it does make it a little bit more enjoyable. I do miss having more heavily armored enemies, but at the same time, I do like a little bit of that chaos at times. Although the smaller humanoid bots increase from the automaton side is a little bit frustrating. I won't lie about that. They are more annoying than they were before. But let me know down in the comments how you feel about this change. Coming up right after that, we've got the Hulk Scorcher, which, thank God, the flamethrower has finally gotten a little bit of a nerf. It's still pretty deadly, and there's times where it does feel like it's still getting pretty close to instant killing you, but 90% of the time you are not going to just immediately get killed by this. Thankfully, they have made it to where it is not a stacking amount of damage, to where as soon as it hits you, it is just consistently doing this burn effect on you. Now it'll hit you one time and do its burning effect for 3 to 4 seconds, and then you will take more damage from that point. It's so much easier to be able to dodge. It's still just as deadly before. You don't want to get caught in it, and you still want to dive to the ground to put yourself out, as you will burn up fairly quickly. But thank goodness they made this change. This is a huge quality of life change for me. The amount of times that I've burned through some reinforcements from just literally having what seems like an ember touch the side of my helmet, and just instantly I'm dead. There is nothing more frustrating than that moment. And I am glad to see that that moment will not be happening anymore. As the kids would say, this is a W change. And just after that, we did have a change to the exosuits. They are much more accurate now. Now both arms seem to be in tune with the crosshair in front of you, and I tried it out with the Emancipator, and it is tenfold better. These things are landing on target just about every time. It is much easier to use. I'm still not the greatest fan of the overall damage output, and I really would like to see it get a little bit of an increase to its overall damage, or possibly replace these autocannons with the autocannon sentry barrels. But that's me personally. But overall, this has truly improved the performance of the Emancipator, and it is something that makes it a little bit more viable. I still feel as though it does have a little bit of an unimpactful effect at times, but that accuracy is definitely a step in the right direction and just makes it much more useful, along with the Patriot exosuit. And just after that, one thing to note is that superior packing methodology is not working right now. There says in the patch notes that they fixed superior packing methodology not working for other peers. This is not working at all right now, as far as I can tell. I have had several times where, when using the spear, which we'll talk about here in a moment, did not end up getting its full resupply every time that I hit the resupply pack, and I've got everything in the ship module. I'm 150 right here. There is no doubt in my mind this should be working, and it's frustrating that it's not, especially now that what we'll talk about here in a moment is working. But this is something that definitely needs to get fixed in the future, and hopefully they will be patching this soon in the future, as let's get to our next topic that is now fixed and enjoyable to use. Last but not least, we've got the spear, which this has gotten improved on its target lock acquisition. This thing is so much better than it was before. This thing is locking onto Bile Titan's chargers so easy now. Sometimes even while I'm reloading, if I hit left trigger, even before I'm finished reloading, that thing's already ready to lock on, and it's green, and I'm just ready to fire. Not always is it going to hit exactly where I want it to, and it doesn't exactly do all the damage I wish it would do, especially when it comes to just the fact that I'm locking on. But it is fairly cool that it is finally actually working as intended, even though superior packing methodology is ruining it a bit, considering I can't fully restock myself. And since superior packing methodology isn't working with the supply pack as well, that's something that they need to look into. But overall, for people out there that have been looking to use the spear more often or enjoyed it beforehand, just were very frustrated at the fact that it wouldn't lock on, you can be rest assured that now it is going to be working properly, but sadly enough, it is not working against automaton spawners such as the fabricators and the factory striders. So sadly enough, it will be a little bit lackluster in those departments, but everything else it should be instantly locking on. And about the only smaller target that I had that it actually locked onto was a stalker, which, funny enough, I wouldn't mind overkilling a stalker with the spear, but in general, I didn't have much issues of this thing locking onto smaller targets that were next to a Bile Titan or a charger. So overall, this is a huge improvement for the spear. Now, when it comes to the shot placement and damage output, that is something that I'd like to see improved upon later on. But that's going to be about all of the most important changes from this patch. Overall, there's been a lot of quality changes. It definitely feels as though we have a bit more versatility when it comes to our overall capabilities of the loadouts that we can put together when it comes to each mission that we're diving into. I'm going to be having a good bit of fun playing around with some of these new stratagems that have been brought up, or especially when it comes to the orbitals and even sentries. Sentries feel like they are much more viable at this point, especially now that the rocket sentry seems like it's going to be more consistent at being able to deal with groups of enemies. I may be able to make a fully sentry loadout and just have a good bit of fun with that. We'll just have to play around with the fact that it's all about where you place the sentry, not exactly about the sentry having the most health, but giving it the best opportunity to be able to survive long enough to dispense all of its ammo into your enemies, and being able to lock down certain positions with them. But let me know down in the comments below if there's anything that I didn't really cover in this, if there's something that you felt was a bit more important to talk about within this, or at the same time how you're feeling about any of the changes that we've seen so far. Do you feel as though they're stepping in the right direction? Do you feel this is much better than the previous patches? It definitely doesn't seem like anything got nerfed, but there are a few things that got changed but didn't exactly see much improvement, which is a bit irritating. But overall, there's so many other things that did end up getting a good buff to them and are much more viable now that it does seem that they are finally heading in a decent direction that doesn't feel as though it's working against the entire player base. And still focusing on the team gameplay, but not so tightly that it ends up making it feel really constricting to the point where you need all 4 players focusing even on one medium enemy to take them down. But let me know how you feel in the comments below. And if you'd like to see more content like this in the future, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty of loadouts coming in the future that we're going to be working with. A lot of these changed up stratagems. It's going to be a good time, so be on the lookout for those in the coming week. And if you'd like to see some of this content live, hit that link down in the description below. Follow me over at Twitch. We'll be streaming daily. And on that note, have a good one.